Last time we covered a lot of stuff. One thing you brought up at the end was reductionism.
Yeah,
that idea.
Mhm.
I have not read your book yet, but I did spot through a few things on it, and it's wonderful. I also looked at it.
Sure.
I looked at another paper you have that you had. It's 45 pages long on that. What is his name? Woodridge or
Woodger? Yeah, that's a sort of historical paper. I'm basically
45 papers.
Yeah, I told you I have this tendency to write long papers. This one,
you do.
Yeah, this is
it.
50. Yeah, this is a 50-page paper. It's a historical paper. It was published in a historical journal, and I mean, this is a little something that annoys me, which is that my discipline has a sort of origin story. Everyone thinks that philosophy of biology began with the work of two guys in the 70s who started looking at questions in modern synthesis. And, basically, if you ask anyone in my field, that's what they say. They say, there is no philosophy of biology before the 1970s.
What two guys?
And that's Michael Ruse and David Hull, two very famous philosophers of biology. And, so this really annoyed me because as I'm sure you gathered from our last conversation, I'm very interested in, in doing sort of integrated history and philosophy of science.
Right.
And it's just a flat lie to say that there is no interesting philosophical engagement with biology prior to the 1970s. And so there's this entire tradition that's been completely forgotten today, and that it was deliberately sort of occluded by these so-called founders of the field, that needs to be reappraised. And so that paper is the first paper in a series of articles where I basically want to show to the community that there is a wide range of riches waiting to be explored by people interested in the philosophy of biology. And you don't even need to look beyond the 20th century. You don't even need to look at stuff written in other languages, even in English, right? And so Woodger is sort of the bête noire. He represents everything that is wrong. He's the one that people have focused on to justify why it is that we should never look at anything before Hull and Ruse came along. So that paper that you saw is essentially a paper showing that this guy Woodger was super interesting. And also that there's a lot to learn from him, that is being completely misunderstood, and sometimes purposefully misunderstood, and that he's just the tip of an iceberg, of a huge iceberg, or a huge sort of pile of literature that was published, especially in the interwar period and the first half of the early 20th century, more generally, and that is very, very relevant to today, because they were engaging with many of the same problems, even if the biology was not, it's from almost 100 years ago. So yeah, right. That's why I wrote that, and written a couple of follow-up papers to that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and quantum mechanics too, and the whole first half of the 20th century. I mean, they were grappling with, I think, similar issues.
Absolutely.
That were about to infect us in some way, one way or another.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this, I think, at the end of last time as well. I mean, the motivations for doing this Schrödinger project have to do with having been interested with this physics-biology interface and the discussions that were happening at that interface in the 1920s and 1930s by people, from quantum mechanics and people from biology wanting to, getting excited about a revolution in biology of the same kind that had happened in biology, in physics, and that revolution really never happened. The sort of it was a different kind of revolution that took biology by storm, and brought it. In a way, it was a backward revolution because it drew on very old physics, on 19th century physical ideas of determinism and mechanics, peppered with a little bit of information theory and cybernetics for good measure.
Yep. So let's see. There's a couple of things. Alyssa Adams from University of Madison. I watched a video yesterday, and she, using math to understand and define life. Have you heard of Alyssa Adams?
No, I haven't.
I'll have to give you a link to this.
Okay.
I will put it in. I'll put this in private chat so you can grab stuff later on. But it was an interesting talk about her point was that if you look at this game of life, right, this game of life that I think Wolfram and a bunch of other people love to play with, where they show you that you can take these 4 or 5 simple rules and you let them evolve, and they create these complex diagrams over and over again, right? And you've probably seen them, and they look like a bunch of triangles and squares, and it just keeps going on and on. And she was making the point that that's very cool, but that's not life, because that pattern will eventually start repeating itself, or it is repeatable every time you run it. It will basically produce exactly the same result. And and she's claiming that we need a new mathematics that's going to show you how the environment or the context and whatever, or will create a non-repeating kind of complexity that keeps changing and changing and changing and evolving over time. And it struck me that this is very similar to this idea of process. And we've got process and state. And last night I was listening to Danny, who found you, who interviewed you. And of course, I was jealous and I had to talk to you because Danny is also an arch enemy in philosophy. Danny was talking to another fellow, Leo Filius, about the mind and philosophy of the mind. And he was, and Danny was talking about causality. And Leo and I both share a real apprehension about talk of causality, because we don't really understand causality. We understand evolution of systems, right? So a system evolving. But when you look at it, if you look at a system, you necessarily try to find states in that system, and you talk about the evolution of those states from one to another. That's basically how we reduce the system and how we figure out what is going on, or we try to make sense out of what's going on, or at least figure out how to manipulate what is going on in the system. But the states themselves do not really exist. It maybe just, like so briefly in such a small instant of time that instant of time doesn't actually exist at all, because it's moving on to the next date and the next date and the next day.
Right.
So for dynamical systems, the only way to reduce them is to do this state talk and look at these state diagrams and try to capture the salient elements of the system and look at the mechanistic state transitions between them, right? So you see where I'm going here, that we have this reduction. And the reduction is what we were talking about last time, the epistemic necessity of wrapping our minds around it. And also it is the way methodological science would work, where this is how we're going to figure out the system and take it apart. We're going to capture it. But then this epistemic reduction becomes our intuition. And I think that is where the problem is.
I mean, reductionism has many, so many different senses and meanings, right? What you were describing there with the stages and the process would be a reduction of the temporal dimension, right? you essentially break down a continuous stream or flow into snapshots, or time slices, and obviously that is not ideal because you lose information that way about the process if you break it down into these temporal sort of snapshots. There's a long discussion in philosophy about that, about whether a movie, for example, is faithfully representing process and time, because basically a movie represents a concatenation of lots of different snapshots,
Right.
which are played together, and then it gives you the illusion of motion, of time. So yeah, and it is true that one can perhaps has to say that that reduction is in some way inevitable, because of the fact that it's so important to how we do science, and maybe we don't have other ways of approaching nature. But there are many different ways of doing that. And in fact, the point I was, if I remember correctly, what I was making last time with regards to reduction is that this alternative view of the cell, it may seem anti-reductionistic because we tend to associate the mechanicist view and the engineering view with a reductionist view, but that in some sense it's also in its own way reductionistic because it's appealing to physical principles, physical concepts to make sense of biological phenomena, right? And so there the question is, what kind of reduction do we think is problematic? And the answer to that is that it's really the genetic form, genetic reductionism mostly that's at fault, especially in molecular biology. So when people, or at least when I talk about the problems with reductionism in the cell, I often mean the reduction of the idea of this genetic preformationism, right? That everything is in some way encoded and preformed in the cell, that the order that you find, in the gene. So the order that you find in the cell and in the organism is in some way reducible to the order that is encoded in the genome. So that's one kind of reductionism, and the other, which is it's a little bit more subtle. One needs to think more carefully whether it's problematic, is the so-called mereological explanatory reductionism, where you essentially have different levels of organization, and you try to explain the high level on the basis of the lower level. Right? But then you have other forms. So you have inter-theoretical reductionism, which is more sort of a philosophical pastime, which is whether, and this was an important research program in the mid-20th century, and it was about whether you can reduce some theories to other theories, whether you can reduce Mendelian genetics, for example, to molecular genetics. And so, that's a completely different sort of debate, even though the word reduction is being used there too. And then, as you mentioned, you have methodological reductionism, methodological reductionism, which is essentially analysis, the process of breaking down, and whether we can really do science effectively without relying on that process of breaking things up. And then there's an even further notion of reductionism, which can be called, Ernst Mayr called it constitutive reductionism or physicalist reductionism, which is essentially whether organisms, whether living beings, have anything that is not physical. Whether we need to postulate some sort of force or substance over and above the physics and chemistry to explain life. And that form of reductionism died in the 19th century. You won't find anyone in the past 100 years defending that. But I mean, historically, that was also one other stage where the anti-reduction debate took place.
Oh, it certainly isn't dead.
Oh, you don't think? You don't? Okay, interesting. You think that the people who say that there's some sort of vital force or energy or substance that makes living things different from non-living things?
I suddenly got a real bad echo. It went away now. Did it?
I don't hear anything. If you want, I can go and get some headphones.
Yeah, I don't know if it was on your side or if it was StreamYard failing to do echo cancellation, because they, you want to try that? Maybe we'll do.
Yeah, sure. I'll go. Just give me a moment, okay?
We'll just have to pick this up again. Test. Yeah, not there now. I don't know.
Hold on a second.
Go, cat. Go. Don't need a cat. I got my drawing pad up on the board.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. It helps me to constrain my runaway mind.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. You're
okay,
fine.
so I got my headphones on now, so hopefully.
Yeah, it could have been. StreamYard has this echo cancellation when you have a microphone, and every now and then, if you don't speak for a while, it takes it a while to kick in.
Okay.
And anyway, well, this will work. Okay, so basically, this idea of life force is very much alive and well in theory of the mind and consciousness, for one thing. Another place it's in effect.
But Mike, even in that, just in the philosophy of mind, what is are these people, those who believe in this force, do they understand it as part of nature? Is it or is it like some metaphysical, unexplainable, mysterious force? I mean, surely that's not something that most people today would want to defend. Anyone committed to naturalism. Dualism. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay.
Yeah, the guy that you talked to, Danny, is very much a dualist, and he does not believe in naturalism and physicalism at all. And he, in fact, thinks we should even go along with Jerry Fodor and throw out the idea of naturalist selection entirely a mechanism, because he doesn't think. Hard to say what these guys think, but I mean, this stuff it's still infiltrating our thinking very much. So. It's not as dead as you kind of imply.
Okay.
You know, vitalism is, right? You know, the idea that there's a life force in all of us.
What's interesting about that, Mike, is I actually am very sympathetic. I mean, this may really surprise you, but I'm very sympathetic to vitalism. Okay, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Historically speaking, these were the guys who were the first to develop comprehensive critiques of the machine conception of the organism. Okay. And if you look at the history of biology, what you have is all these people who were unhappy with many of the same things that I'm unhappy with, who tried to propose cogent critiques of these ideas. Okay. And also alternative explanations. Now, obviously, the alternative explanations that they offered were not great, okay?
Right.
But even there, I mean, when, for example, they postulated vital forces, if you look at the history, what you realize is they were trying to be respectable scientists. And again, this may sound super weird, but it's not, because what they were doing was following the footsteps of Newton. Newton had brought into the mechanical world picture an appeal to a force that he could not explain, gravity. Gravity really doesn't fit comfortably with a mechanical world picture. It didn't initially, because it postulated action at a distance. And you had other theories of gravity, like people like Descartes, who had this vortex theory where you have to postulate things bumping into other things, right? And so when that theory was proposed, he had a really hard time basically convincing his contemporaries to make it seriously. He had long-standing debates and acrimonious debates with Leibniz and others about this. In the end, gravity we could not be ignored. Newton's theory of gravity because it was so damn useful and successful in explaining phenomena, right? The equation, the universal law of gravitation was just too useful to ignore. But whenever he was asked, so what's the nature of this force that you're postulating? He would always say, look, this is not my job. I'm not here to tell you as a natural philosopher. I can't tell you anything about the origin. All I can do is describe its effects. Okay. And so given Newton's position, right, and the fact that he became almost synonymous with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, all the biologists in the 18th century, okay, were basically looking up to Newton. And so in biology, some of them thought that the best way to be a good Newtonian was to postulate a force that they could not explain, but that they could describe effectively to make sense of a complex phenomenon like embryogenesis. Right. So appeals to vital forces in the 18th century were totally scientific. The reason now we think they're not is because history is written by the winners, and we've got these awful histories, right, from the present position, basically shitting on all these great biologists because they do not conform to the view that we have today, right? There's no historical sensitivity. So that's the reason why I think that we should not be extremely dismissive of vitalism, because they had the heart in the right place. They knew that we wouldn't be able to have a good theory of the organism if we rely on mechanicism. And also, these are the people who develop biology as an autonomous science. Also, people forget that. The first calls for a science of biology that would be irreducible to physics and chemistry, that would require its own theoretical principles, its own concepts, was made by vitalists, right? So there's been a huge historical injustice that's been made to the vitalists, and that's why I think one should look upon these people, historically at least, in a more measured way. Now, it's a totally different question about vitalism today. Now, I don't, but I don't think that anyone really has defended vitalism in a strong form since the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, Driesch was probably the last prominent vitalist, but anyway, this is a longer conversation. But just to explain why it is that I don't have that massive sort of problem with vitalism, despite being completely committed to naturalism.
Well, that's wonderful. That gives me an entirely different view on that. So yeah. I can agree with that, and that's kind of refreshing, actually. This idea of there is a force, gravity, and we know it's there. It damn works. It's real, but it's just like, not my job to tell you what it is.
Right.
But then
it's not science's job. Yeah.
The discussion on dualism last night. Well, basically there is this dual mind, right? This dualism, and Leo was pressing back on Danny to tell me what is this dualism? How does this dualism interact with physical mind, or with physical brain? And Danny was basically saying, that's not my job. That's and he would put the burden back on Leo to show how physicality, how the physical created mind, right? And Leo kept saying, oh no, if you're going to postulate this dual substance or dual force, then you have to tell me how it interacts with mind. So they went back and forth, and they kept kicking the ball until they got tired. Which is what happens, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, but it's interesting. But then when it comes to philosophy of the mind is something that we have ill specified for ourselves. What is mind to me, to us, that sort of thing. It's ill specified. And there are all of these basically vitalistic or dualistic ideas about, oh, here's what it is, but it's not our job to tell you how that works, right? But I think that's wrong-headed.
Absolutely.
Other than that, it points out that there is some work that we need to do on specifying mind. But let's try to bring that to either evolution or the cell, and try to figure out what do we need. Dennis Noble, you're very much What do you think of Dennis Noble and the whole effort there? Or are you
Yeah, I
following
mean,
that?
I have read his book on the music of life. He has a
Yeah.
more recent book on biological relativity. Yeah, fine. I mean, he's one of these old school physiologists who has gone through what I like to call a philopause, where you have at the end of it's like what some scientists go through, where you have this sudden crisis of no longer feeling relevant, or maybe not longer being interested in doing lab work, and you get interested in philosophical questions. You go to sort of midlife crisis kind of thing, where you start getting interested in the philosophy of science, and then you spend your later years writing papers and books on the conceptual foundations of your discipline.
Right.
I mean, it's just a little joke, but that's when you find often scientists doing philosophy of science, right? Where at the end of their careers usually, and that's I think what Noble has been doing for the past decade or two, and I'm very much on board with most of what he says. He has this critique of genetic reductionism. I think that's his thing, and his idea that we should think of causation as something that happens at different levels. The metaphor with music is fine. I mean, I don't think it solves all the problems, but I mean, there's nothing. It's a refreshing alternative perspective to have. And then what else has he written on? I mean, I see him as wanting to bring questions in physiology to the front of the agenda, right? He's a physiology guy, and I think that physiology is the science that constantly has to worry about the relationship between levels. Do we explain everything at the molecular level? What do we lose if we do that, right? So yeah, I think that it's good to have someone not coming from evolution who is engaging in philosophical questions about things like reductionism, emergence, and things like that.
Yeah, and he's been he has also been quote mined extensively by the intelligent design creationism
Really?
faction. Yeah.
How so?
Particularly, I forget which part of his book. I think it was "Dance to the Tune of Life." Was that?
Yeah, that's the more recent one. So why does he give any reasons in that book that that could be used favorably by the intelligent design people?
Oh no, but they quote mine. They take little pieces, and I would have to do some digging. Hold on a minute. I'm coughing up a hairball. Cats. Anyway, I would have to do some digging to find it, but I got into a very early debate with a guy, John Maddox, the guy that interviewed Ben Golt.
Yeah.
And it was, and he immediately pulled out a Dennis Noble quote on, I think it's something to do with information or abiogenesis. And anyway, yeah, he's heavily quote mined, and he's also the Royal Society put together this group of people with Dennis Noble to offer a $10 million prize for anybody that created a self-programming code, like something that would create the DNA code from very simple principles, right? A natural system to create a code, DNA. And they offered a $10 million prize. Well, it turns out that several of the people putting up the money were intelligent designers themselves. And Dennis Noble was, so they've all become sort of champions of this misinformation that's coming from the intelligent design and creationist crowd. And it's kind of the same mess we were talking about just shortly before we hit the record button with this amount of misinformation that's going on at the surface that's being fed into the populace, and affecting how we think about science, and in effect creating a pseudoscience initiative in this country that is getting more and more powerful. And it basically taps into anybody that happens to use the wrong language.
Yeah.
On this is the cell as a machine, and that's one of the ways you would one of the things that you push back on. But at the same time, they would also use vitalism, and they use Dennis Noble's rather grander ideas of multiple hierarchies and feedback to basically do the same thing. They're going to use anything, I guess, is what I'm.
That's really surprising to me, because
Yeah.
Noble is not committed. It's easy. I mean, I sit alongside him on many of the views that he has on how we should think about organisms. Like I can't. It must be a very ingenious twisting of his ideas to find evidence or support for intelligent design. I mean,
yeah,
maybe. Okay, one thing that you touched upon that could be one way in which you could draw a connection is the people that I'm interested in, and the tradition that I'm trying to revive and reappraise is one that emphasizes the integrated nature of biological systems. So I guess that, I'm just guessing here, that the fact that if you have people making a case for the system being very integrated and talking about causation at different levels, that poses an even tougher challenge to those wanting to explain how it came about in the first place. So if your work is showing how complex and how well integrated biological systems are, that makes things a bit more difficult for those wanting to understand the origins of those systems.
Right.
So maybe that's where it's coming from. But yeah, I still think it's twisting completely what he's saying.
Yeah, I think life is the only thing like this. It's the only example we have of this. Well, maybe not, but it seems like the only example we have physically of this thing that basically creates more and more complexity and more layers and feedback and creates something kind of like information, or at least we want to call it information. And it seems like life is the only example of that, and it's a very, 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 very tough thing to get our minds around.
But yeah, I mean, that's what makes it so exciting to be thinking about life. Right. I mean, that's why I'm in the business. It's yeah, absolutely.
So this is like the biosemiotic triangle, right? Where you have the I think I don't know the terms, but you got like, this is a signifier or a sign, and this is the interpretant, or the thing that interprets the sign, and then this is the what do they call it? The result, or resultandum, or something. I don't know. So this is the result of some biological system, right? And then you've got, and then from here, so this result feeds into another. It becomes the sig, or the sign of another system that goes up here, and it has another interpretant that basically creates another result, or another object that it's referring to. So this would be the word, and this would be the object referred to, and this would be the human that puts the word together with the object, right? So that's it's basic semiotics, right? And then it goes up, and we can grab another color, and hopefully this will make some sense here when I draw my third color. And we have another interpretant, and we have still another thing, right? And so we got another system. But the and this is what they're trying to do in semiotics with cell signaling, basically showing one signal to the next signal to the next signal. But then you got the issue of, what if this feeds back into one of the earlier systems, right? Or the basically the interpretant, or the function that interprets, feeds back into one of the earlier interpretants. So now we have all these loops, right? And we have these multiple hierarchies. And my hope for biosemiotics was that they would develop this in a mathematical sense and start to make a little more sense out of these multiple hierarchies, right, of feedback going both ways, because certainly we can have something from over here going way up there, right? So we kind of got I think it's what's called a hot mess. I don't know.
Right.
Hot messism or whatever. But anyway, that's one way to start to one approach to start trying to unwind this idea of multiple hierarchies. And of course, the other one is dynamical systems and what we know about dynamical systems and how they overlap. But how do we recover this? How do we get a foothold in understanding this stuff?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with in principle with an approach like this, as long as we remember that these molecules can do more than one thing, right? Often do more than one thing, and so that you can't place too much hope or faith in any sort of network diagram that you end up with if you continue to do this, because you will do other sorts of experiments which will show that these molecules are performing other functions, and so that will complicate the picture. But I mean, of course, we have to start somewhere, and mapping out how molecules interact with one another is how we've proceeded, and it's an important part of understanding what's going on. So the idea of promiscuity of function would need to be factored in, and then the other would be the fact that we're dealing with large numbers, right? That many of the things that happen in the cell happen because we remember the cell environment is stochastic, and so you can't assume these sorts of pathways or processes to be happening in a deterministic, regular way. Instead, what you have is the cell relying on probabilistic collision events, where it's extremely unlikely that everything will go wrong, right? That's if you have a sufficient number of proteins in the right vicinity that you'll have certain functions being performed. But that's so again, this is what happens when you abstract away too much from the reality, from the physical reality of the cell. Then you can end up forgetting a lot of important factors, right? So that's really the issue I have with these sorts of diagrams and stuff, that they are a good approximation, maybe a good starting point, but they don't give you the full picture.
Yeah, basically would be the method of taking the system apart and looking at each piece of it and looking for the salient parts, right? And so we've got this biochemical diagram here, that we can get a lot of information from, and we can kind of find, if we're interested in a certain product up here at the top, basically we figure out how this mechanism contributes to that product for the most part.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And what we may miss is all of the other little factors that are also affecting this, or some other pathway that's creating that product. And now in evolution, the interesting thing is we have this concept of what used to be called junk DNA and what I like to call workshop DNA, where you have all of this DNA that's producing these intermediate products that will produce like a pathway, and they'll go this far, but they will never quite get to that product, right? So this particular pathway is active in the cell, and it is affecting the overall health and nature of that cell, but it doesn't do anything useful at all yet, until some modification comes along that makes it useful. And now we have two ways to get this product. We have this orange path and we have this green path to get the same product, right? So now if something went wrong in this path and this path no longer worked, then this path would become more and more important and take over. So there's all of these very, very, these there's all of these broken mechanisms that are jumbling around and hitting each other and coming together until one of them finds a pathway from, you know, starter to product that makes a really big difference in the cell. And that becomes a brand new evolutionary token, you know, something new.
Yeah, that's well, another thing that we tend to forget is that there's a lot of order already in the cell, all right, that serves as a template for everything that happens. You don't have to, you know, devise any of these things from scratch. A lot of, you know, biochemical reactions and a great deal of the cellular architecture is based on sort of template replication, or it relies on a pre-existing order that is there, right, which provides the background, the enabling conditions for many of these reactions to take place. And that's very important because it explains why it is that it's often difficult to recreate these sorts of reactions in vitro, where you are removing these molecules from their cellular context. The cellular context provides everything that needs to be there for these reactions to be able to take place. So the problem with mechanistic explanations is that they just take that for granted. They don't factor that. I mean, they have to assume it, but it's not explicitly mentioned. And so you get this misleading conclusion that certain things happen just because of certain molecules bumping into each other, and that obviously is not the case. You're just not, what you're doing is you're using a magnifying glass, right, and you're narrowing down your focus on a particular set of causal relations that you're interested in foregrounding. But for any of those processes to work, that they have to be embedded in an existing order, right, off the cell, where you have lots of temporal and spatial order that enables these reactions to take place. So any explanation of them has to in some way refer to that, and often we don't. We just take it for granted. Of course we know that this is happening inside a cell, but you know, this is very important. And unless you're asking about the origins of order, then, and for the most part, you don't need to, you know, you can sort of avoid talking about it, right? But so that's the other thing I wanted to mention. So it's important to distinguish two sorts of questions that we can ask, right? So we can ask questions about how something works, what's the nature of the process that you're looking at, and you can ask a question about how it came to be. And often, especially obviously people working on the evolutionary side of biology tend to conflate these and think that we should always have in mind that question of how something came to be as we're describing it. And I think that's a mistake. I think that we should confront the complexity of the system in its own terms and work out how it does what it does. And then, you know, the question of how it came to be, of course, is important, but it's a different question, you know. And I think that sometimes we have been inclined to underestimate the complexity of something because we wanted to make sure that we could tell a narrative about how that thing came into existence in the first place. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that's not an important question. I'm just saying that often it's helpful to keep these two separate.
Yeah. Well, sometimes how it came to be tells us a little bit about that background context that is still in play in the cell and may be important for how a cancer develops, for instance, that sort of thing. Because how it came to, some of the remnants or the fossils of how something came to be are still present somewhat in that genome, and they're going to come around and have an effect. So
sure.
But I'm trying to get back to this. Let's see. Epistemic notion of mechanism, basically. So you talked about that in I forget which paper.
The concept of mechanism in biology.
Okay, the concept of mechanism, right? The epistemic notion of mechanism that was needed in order to understand. So it comes back to that reduction, that that we reduce things, that we take this evolving state, this evolving dynamical state, and we've got this very, very complex worm through time, right? Our four-dimensional worms, and we're taking a particular state here and a particular point in that state, and we're trying to find out how it gets to the next state. So that's typically the only way that for some differential equations, that is the only thing we can do, is make these take these localities, these what are they called? I lost the word mathematically, but basically trying to decide this part, coming up with that reduction, and we come up, we come up with the small part. So, but then taking that and mistaking that for the reality of what's really going on is the problem. And that's the problem we get when we say the cell is a machine. That we fell in love with our epistemic reduction to the point where now we think that is what is actually reality.
Yeah. I think that's what's happened. Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you? And you're getting a lot of pushback on some of this stuff, right?
Well, I mean, I'm being asked as I would expect. Of course, you get pushback. You get people asking, surely what you're saying relies on the notion of machine that you start off with, for example. That's a common objection. Or, how do you explain the fact that it's been very successful if it's wrong?
Right.
Why, if it's really that problematic and that wrong, then why is it that people appeal to it? And that's great. I mean, it's good to have these objections, because it sharpens my position, right? So with regards to the I don't know if you want me to go into those, or I can if you want. I can. If not, we can move on to something else as you like.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with the first one, where someone says, surely is this all just a linguistic problem? Surely you can imagine creating a machine that has all the properties that you describe typical of an organism. My answer to that is that I'm interested not in any, in all the possible worlds and all possible machines that could potentially exist. I'm interested in the kinds of machines that biologists have in mind when they resort to the machine analogy and the machine metaphor. And the kinds of machines that biologists have in mind are familiar machines. They're not extremely complex, self-organizing machines, if there is such a thing, but rather the machines that we use every day, computers, mechanical contrivances. And a lot of the explanatory power of these sorts of conceptions derive precisely from their familiarity, that we know how they work, we understand how things happen, and so we have the expectation and the hope that we can project that understanding onto biology, into unfamiliar domain. Yeah. So it's not about how to define it. It's about what sorts of machines do biologists have in mind when they appeal to it. But I mean, I have tried to characterize the difference between living systems and mechanical systems in ways that speak to more generic differences. So in one way of doing this is appealing to thermodynamics, and to say that living systems exist far from thermodynamic equilibrium, whereas machines exist in near equilibrium conditions, that organisms exist in a sort of steady state, where the entropy production is kept at a minimum by means of a constant exchange of energy and matter with the environment, right? The order of the system is maintained at the expense of increasing the disorder of the environment, right? And that steady state is a constant, has to be kept far from equilibrium constantly, and it's irreversible. So that if you lose that steady state, then that's what we refer to as death in biology. The dying means to lose to the cessation of that far from equilibrium steady state. Whereas in the case of a mechanical system, you can slip back and forth from equilibrium to near equilibrium conditions, which is why you can switch on machines and then turn them off. You can't turn off an organism, right? If you turn off an organism, it dies, and we can't recover the steady state. So thermodynamics gives us a way not only of thinking about life and death, having sort of simple physical definitions of what it means to die or what it means to be alive, but also explains, for example, why it is that you can't interrupt life. You can slow it down, and organisms have evolved ways of doing this, right? Spores and seeds are all ways of reducing the rate of metabolism, but you can't completely stop it, right? You can't completely. There has to be some basal metabolic activity for thermodynamic reasons. Another thing that thermodynamics helps us to do is to understand why life is a process, right? It's precisely because it needs to be maintained constantly that it has to be constantly doing something. You can't have life not doing anything. To live is to act, to be doing. You got this interesting connection between existence and activity that you don't have in machines. You can turn off a machine and not worry about it anymore. When you park your car at nights and you go home, and then in the following morning you come out, you don't think, you don't have to worry that the car is going to disintegrate. But if you leave your cat in your attic or whatever for a couple of days, then you won't have a cat when you return, right?
Right.
It's so that's something quite profound and interesting about life that can be explained in a fairly straightforward way by thermodynamics. And that explains
Schrodinger's cat in the attic.
Yeah, right. So that's one way of thinking about this distinction of biological versus mechanical systems.
Right.
And you can freeze and Frank the cat. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, my mind is going to Frankenstein. Basically, it's alive. We have a living system, then it dies and it's frozen, then we unthought, and then we basically try to reconstruct what our reductive idea of what was going on when it was alive, right down here.
Mm-hmm.
So we take our best shot at reductive knowledge of what made that thing alive, and we turn it back on, and we don't have a living cat, we've got a Frankenstein cat. So we've got because we missed something. So trying to get our minds around what did we miss, basically, when we go from when we take our best knowledge and try to reconstruct or create a cell, and it turns out to not be a cell at all and not live at all. It's not alive. It doesn't have that vitalism, right? That vital something. So what I struggle with is how we start to get our minds around what that vitality is, what that missing part is. I mean,
go on, sorry.
Yeah, obviously in our Frankenstein, we would have created something with gears, mechanisms, and one lever, sort of a Rube Goldberg machine, but it would not ever come back to life like this thing was, because this thing was something else. What is that something else, and how do we approach that? So how do we figure out what that is?
One thing that we need to bear in mind here is to not conflate two sets of distinctions: the distinction between organism and machine, and the distinction between natural versus artificial origins. So I think that that's one way which I don't think is very successful, but one way to distinguish between a standard way of distinguishing between organisms and machines is to say organisms have evolved and machines are constructed. The origins are different. But I prefer to focus on the organizational dynamics of these systems to make sense of their differences, because if not, then you are in that situation where your argument relies on us in the future not being successful in creating life from scratch. And that seems like a silly position to be in, right? So I don't think it's in principle impossible to create life from scratch, and we will see. I mean, we know it's happened once already, right? In the when life originated initially, it did so without help. Well, okay, maybe it's slightly different because but the point is that I don't have a problem in imagining that in the future we can synthesize, we can create a living system. But that I wouldn't say that means that we now have a machine, right? I don't think that machines are machines only or even mainly because of how they came into existence. There are machines because of the fact that, as I said, they have the sort of organizational dynamics that makes them, more static, that makes them be close to thermodynamic equilibrium, right? To be, as I've said in other papers, to be extrinsically purposive in some sense. So you can look at the teleological and organization to make sense of these of the differences. But if it was the case that one could create a system that exhibited all of the properties that we associate with life, self-organization, self-maintenance, self-regeneration, and that it's self-reproduction, and that has this autonomous organization, then I wouldn't have a problem in calling that life. And I don't think that would mean anything as far as the debate with machines versus organism are concerned, because, as I said before, that debate has to do with the sorts of characteristics that familiar machines exhibit, and how those are then illegitimately imported into biology to do explanatory work. That's where my beef is. I don't have a problem. I don't want to have this semantic debate about how we should define these concepts. What I want to know is how best to understand what life is. What sort of concepts do we need to make sense of the organization of a living system? If you then, 100 years from now or 500 years from now are able to create a system that exhibits those features, then fine. It doesn't really solve the issue or help us. What matters is, as I say, the concepts and principles that we are using to characterize biological systems, and whether we can do that by using, by appealing to properties that are that we associate with the familiar machines that we use every day.
Yeah, thinking about the development of life, starting out way back here at the rock. Basically we have the prebiotic Earth, right? And it developed and it went along these lines, and at every stage it had to be alive. It had to have this systematic living thing, right? And then we go ahead and try to recreate based on our best reductive principles out here, and we fail, right? And we failed in some manner because we have constructed this path or this mechanistic path, right? And what we have missed is this weirder little tiny pieces that shore up the whole dynamically. Right? So at each stage that we're going along here, there are all of these little unknowns, that we would require a tremendous amount of computation to reproduce out here. And this computation has happened over time. So there is no, like DNA in a flask does nothing all by itself. It's just a kind of a white yucky substance, right, that precipitates. It does nothing. It requires an existing cell, which of course came from another organism back here and another organism back here, and changed all along the way. But every time it changed with a tremendous amount of computation that filled in all of these little cracks and holes. Do you?
Yeah. I mean, there's this one very nice analogy that I've seen being referred to. I don't remember right now where I saw it. I think it might have been in a book on Origins of Life, where it's basically what you're saying here, what you're describing here, where you have a bridge, okay, which is made up of pebbles that are stuck together in a way that it creates an arch between two parts, right? And then if you want to, you have that bridge and you're thinking, wow, that's amazing. How do I reconstruct that? And the the origin of the bridge is that you had a pile of pebbles, and then you removed all the ones below them so that you only have, in the end, the bridge that stays at the end, right? Yeah. So unless you do that whole process, you can't get at the final, you can't recreate the final end product without by skipping all these intermediate stages. If you try to do that, then the bridge will fall down. So Perfect. I think this is exactly what you're describing, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I think nothing in biology makes sense without evolution.
Yeah.
That statement, nothing, if we don't have all of these little intermediate pieces of this progression from one zygote to the next with very, very small changes all along the way that manage to fit all of those little cracks and pebbles to the point where, the bridge held, we fail to understand what we have here. So it's a dynamical system that goes all the way back to the very beginnings of the Earth and life and the geosystem and all of that.
Yeah.
And that's a huge picture. And I think that's becoming obvious in medicine today, because we're trying to come up with these reductive fixes like chemotherapy, right? And it turns out that is a very big hammer on a very, very tiny little problem, and we end up wrecking the whole cell instead of fixing the cell, curing it, whatever. Yeah. So there's all of this, all of these very small parts that are interdependent. Every one of them is interdependent on every other one.
Yeah. And I also, I maybe not in the majority position in my field, because my field has been traditionally very much concerned with questions in evolutionary theory, and I see my work as an attempt to broaden up the space of conversation so that we're talking about things other than evolution, even though, of course, evolution, there are lots of good reasons for being interested philosophically in it. And it relates to what I was saying before about, distinguishing between questions about how something came to be and what something is and how we characterize it in its present state. Now, I think that, of course, in some sense, nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution, although we could talk about, who said that and why he said it. There's a very interesting history to that mantra that is now repeated. Dobzhansky, yeah. We can talk about that if you like in a moment. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, my point is that if I want to understand the organization of the cell, I should, in my opinion, we should not get distracted by understanding. I mean, this is, you may disagree, and it's fine. I mean, I think it's important to focus on what we have and try to make sense of that organization, because and as a starting point, we can't put the cart before the horse. I mean, we can my focus is on what we need to, because many people, sorry, I'm having difficulty articulating this because I haven't thought about this in a while, but we obviously want to have a story in biology that is naturalistic and that enables us to tell have an evolutionary explanations of how things ended up being the way they are, of course, okay? But, very often for most biologists, the question is understanding what's going on. It's not understanding how things came to be the way they are. And of course, you will not have a complete explanation of the system until you have an account of its origins. So I'm with you there, but we can actually characterize a great deal about a biological system or any system without focusing on evolution. So, for example, this characterization I gave you in terms of thermodynamics doesn't say anything about the origins of the systems, but it's helpful, So, I mean, I say this because often these things get put together in the same place, and I don't know. I mean, maybe you can convince me that you if you think that I don't know, because I'm open to change my mind about this. But in my experience, I've often found it a little bit frustrating. So, for example, with regards to what we were talking about just before about the the cell comes from a pre-existing cell, and unless you realize that, then unless you realize that, you're not going to create a living system. But most of biology isn't concerned with that question of creation. So maybe, do you want to speak on behalf of that argument and try to give arguments for why you think that we should keep in mind evolutionary considerations when characterizing organization?
Oh, that puts me on
in the
spot.
present.
At least we found something to fight about. We found something to fight about. This is good. This is awesome. But okay, we have the system that is. But the thing is that when if you're looking at the system today, it is this overlapping system that goes all the way back to the past, right? And so, so we're looking today basically at a small slice of time, and you're looking at how these how these loops interact right now. So that would be the what is, right? And I'm saying that it is almost impossible to separate the what was 1 moment ago, and therefore 2 moments ago, and 3 moments ago, and 4 moments ago, because there's this dynamicism that runs on the temporal axis, as well as the what's happening now axis. Well, process has to happen over time, right? So we're looking over time. So if I'm looking at what is happening in a cell right now, I cannot leave out what was happening in the cell 3 moments ago, or a week ago, or when the cell actually budded off from its parent and differentiated into what it is right now, right? So that's kind of what I'm saying is that, but I understand what you're saying is that, oh, hell, we're taking this big, huge leap and saying, 4 billion years ago, we got to talk about that to talk about what's now.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that, look, life is complex enough as it is in the present for us to have to constantly keep in mind also. We have enough problems understanding what the hell a cell is today, right? To have to constantly have in the back of our mind, wait, you need to make sure that everything you say, you have an immediate account of how it came to be. I think that account has to be given, but I think if I were to say the order of priority, the order of explanatory priority, and here again, maybe we disagree, and I'm sure I disagree with many of people who working in evolutionary theory, I think that we should begin first with what we have, and then try to explain if it is even possible to distinguish them, because what you say is interesting. Maybe it's not possible to I haven't totally made up my mind about this, so maybe it's not possible to explain something as it exists today without appealing to how it came to be the way it is. But think of the contrast between in vivo and in vitro sort of explanations, right, in molecular biology, where you essentially have people looking at proteins in vivo in real time, and people synthesizing proteins in a test tube and recreating certain reactions. There, I guess we agree, because we both think that the in vitro reconstructions are going to be, just gross idealizations, and right. So that's I think we both agree there. But where what is needed is factoring in sort of that cellular context, right? The background conditions that enable everything basically to take place. And, my point is simply, I think one is able to one can try to characterize all of that without having to worry about its origin. I don't know. I mean, maybe not. I'm thinking about this as I'm talking.
Yeah. So there's. Okay, this picture of the cell right here, basically, there's, we've got the nucleus here, and we've got the DNA strung out here in basically each chromosome has a territory inside of the nucleus. They figured it out in the last 10, 15 years. And so every chromosome has its own territory here, and every chromosome has this, and it has some loops running out basically into the area where it can be transcribed. So basically this 4D, they call it the 4D nucleome, I think it is. This 4D structure of the cell came to be. Every cell type has, its own sort of general structure, but it came to be because this is a cell lineage, right? So you almost have to look at the embryogenesis of the cell in order to figure out why this one cell is this type and another cell is another type, right?
Yeah, but remember,
the structure
go on.
The structure of what we have now is very much determined by these states, these past states, right? Going back to the beginning of to the zygote for an organism. So I'm trying to figure out how, you want to capture what we have now, but then you're being terribly reductive temporally.
Absolutely. And I want to say, so obviously I don't want to say that time isn't important. Of course, a lot of my work has been to show that it is, all the stuff on process is precisely an attempt to make biologists more aware of the importance of considering time. So that's not my point. I like this quote from Waddington, where he says that that biology studies 4 different kinds of change. He says that you have basically how an animal functions from minute to minute, from hour to hour. I'm just reading this quote. In feeding, digesting, respiring, using its muscles, nerves, glands, these processes of physiological functioning are basically, that's one level, right? So you have metabolism and physiology. That's one temporal scale, okay? Then you have processes which are at a slower tempo, which have to do with the life history of the system, its development, right? And that is studied by development, right? And then you have even slower processes which are across generations, which is the province of genetics, right? And then finally, the even slower processes of evolution.
Right.
So, metabolism studied by physiology, or chemical process of metabolism studied by physiology, the morphogenetic or morphogenic processes studied by development, the process of inheritance studied by genetics, and evolution. And so you can think of biology then as being concerned with these 4 different timescales, from the relatively short to the relatively long, right? And I think that all of them are important.
Right.
And all I'm saying is that we should not reduce the first 3 to the 4th one. That's
okay.
That's where.
But what I'm saying is that evolution is happening even at every level. So basically, even at the metabolism. So a cell is doing what it's doing today, but it's not going to be doing tomorrow the same as what it was doing today. It's going to be doing it just a little bit closer to death. So all of these 4 things are happening. I mean, evolution is happening maybe slowly, but maybe quicker than we thought. Maybe we're missing something, that going from one generation to another, there is a significant and detectable evolution that causes your grandpa or your daddy to be somewhat different than you are. And basically we can't just take one of these things and concentrate on it and cast aside the others just because we imagine that this is happening very slowly. This evolution may be just a little quicker than we thought.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say that what you just described there is more. You can think of these 4 things, right, or 4 areas of biology as different levels of description. They're not mutually. They're not like non-overlapping. They totally overlap, right?
Right.
But so what you just described there would be of interest to someone, for example, interested in genetics. So if there are differences between parent and offspring, that's traditionally the province of genetics. That doesn't mean that it's not relevant for evolution. It's just that an evolutionist is looking at things at a different temporal scale. But these temporal scales, it's all part of the same thing, right? It's an epistemic division, not an ontological one. So, I'm not trying to say that evolution is not relevant from one generation to the next. What I'm saying is that depending on the questions that you want to answer, right? These questions may be physiological questions, or embryological, or genetic, or evolutionary, and not all the questions are evolutionary. Many questions about inheritance can be framed and explained and studied on their own terms. Of course, they will have evolutionary implications. My point is that often I find some of my colleagues always focusing on that final level of description of evolution, where I think that we may miss interesting parts of the picture, where if we don't think of the metabolic timescale, for example. This stuff on thermodynamics, I told you, like, this is fairly straightforward stuff, and yet a lot of people are surprised to hear it, because I think that we should bear those sorts of things more in mind when we're thinking about life, that you've got all these processes happening at different timescales, and they're all important to understanding life, not just the final sort of evolutionary one, even if, as you say, the processes that are happening in short timescales are also relevant to evolution.
Yeah. Oh, Waddington was the one that came up with these landscapes, right? With the
landscape
idea,
with the epigenetic landscape. Yeah.
So that's
Waddington.
Yeah, that's my horrible 2D drawing of his beautiful 3D drawings. Anyway, but one of the things that I'm thinking about is here, like, we've got germs right here, right? The germ line. So this purple line down here at the bottom is the germ line, right? And that's happening. There's a very, very small amount of change that's going on between one germ line to the next germ line, and that adds up to this big amount of change, which is evolution. But what we are is springing from this germ line. We are the mushrooms, or the mushroom body, or the fruiting body of the mushroom. Our whole lives were basically mushrooms, and our only purpose is this germ line down here, for intergenerationally, right? But our lives are spent on this line right here. But so you have about maybe 14 cell divisions, I think, on this germ line that give you the opportunity for that evolutionary change that makes a difference, right? Okay. But in our lifetime, what we are as an organism that is capable of reproducing has a great deal of cell divisions and potential evolutionary change over the course of our lifetime that is probably much higher than what's happening in the germline. Yeah. You see where I'm going there? So I'm saying that the evolution of us from embryo to reproducing organism, of course, that is where fitness comes into play, and then we live on and collect Social Security for a while, but we're evolving the whole time. So that's kind of so that would be my pushback on, let's not dispel what's happening in terms of evolution overall, because evolution, there are going to be these changes in the germline, and we've upset the equilibrium just a little bit with these mutations. And the overall, it's going to find the pebbles that hold that bridge up, basically. Right. And that is the only reason why it's going to make it to that next generation. That's the only reason why this thing is going to grow a mushroom, right? Actually, this is the mutational line, but this is the actual line that makes the difference, because that's where reproduction happens, that diagonal line, that sort of thing. But I'm saying that looking at the evolutionary perspective, looking back over the whole, and saying that this is an evolving, overlapping system may be as important at the organismal one phenotype level as it is overall. That this is also happening in our bodies. That's
absolutely. I mean, I don't think we're really disagreeing here, because all I'm saying is that the fact, for example, that you have inheritance across generations that is not only in the germline, so the crossing of the Weismann's barrier, as it's called, is something that is, as far as I'm concerned, primarily an issue for genetics, right? Because genetics studies inheritance. So all I'm trying to say is, Mike, that yes, this stuff has relevance for evolution, but it can be studied if you're studying it from one generation to the next, then what you're doing is you're doing genetics. You're not doing, when evolutionary considerations require you really to consider lineages over long periods of time, right?
Yeah.
So it really depends on the questions that you want to ask. I mean, no organism evolves. It is wrong to say, really, technically speaking, that an organism is evolving, because you've got the wrong level of resolution, right?
Yeah.
You're right. An organism develops. An organism metabolizes. There is, if you want to talk about heredity and inheritance, you already need to talk about two organisms. You can no longer talk about heredity only thinking about one organism. Do you see what I'm saying? So it really depends of your level of resolution, what kind of biology you're going to be doing. And what I'm saying is that we shouldn't reduce all of them. I mean, I think you agree. I mean, I think we're on the same page here, that we shouldn't reduce all of them to just to the final one, because that means we're going to be perhaps not less inclined to focus on what's going on in the lifespan of a single organism, right? If you're concerned with evolutionary questions, you are often not thinking about individuals, you're thinking about populations. So that's already a bias, right? Because if you're a population geneticist, anything that you say about individuals is derived from knowledge of populations. You're dealing with statistical means. So it's about what you're interested in explaining. And you can really think of biology really as being split. So this is one way of splitting what biology is in different levels. Another way is thinking about the distinction between individual and populational biology, right? So you can think of physiology and anatomy and all these morphology as concerned with the individual, and then you can think of natural history, evolutionary biology, ecology as being concerned, biodiversity, biogeography, all these things concerned with populations. And the sorts of questions that biologists ask really depends on where they stand in relation to this distinction, right? And what I've often noticed is that the questions about the individual are sometimes just the abstracted away. The individual disappears, and the individual is then reappears as an artificial construction of knowledge that you derived from looking at populations. So what I see is happening in evolutionary biology, actually, these calls for an extended evolutionary synthesis, what these amount to, and I've written about this as well, is they amount to a desire to bring back the organism, right? Bring back the individual. You can't explain everything about evolution by focusing only on, changes in allele frequencies in populations. That you need to look at processes that are happening in the individual, processes like development and like inheritance. And that unless we do that, we're not going to have a full picture of evolution. And that's precisely what's happening, right? The modern synthesis view was abstracted away development. It abstracted away, in fact, the entire organism. It told us that we could explain evolution without even thinking about individuals. Why? Because evolution happens across, in populations and across long periods of time. So it doesn't really make sense to think about evolution at the individual level and at a single moment. But that's just we need to bring back the organism, because also a great deal of what we're doing in biology is concerned with the individual. I don't know if any of that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly. I think that's exactly what I'm saying. But I'm saying that the two things are the same thing, and what we may be missing in the coarse-grained attempt to look at just populations over long periods of time is that we may be missing all of the fact that this is the same process going both ways, going along two axes here. Toward the organism. What is happening in the organism is the same thing that's happening along that long germline, and it's very important. See, the problem is we have the germline here, okay? So, we're concentrated on the germline, but that doesn't really exist. What's really happening is it goes up here. The organism has to be alive for a while, and then it goes down here and it produces another one, right? And then if we have a population, we have all of these little interactions going on, sexual selection, all sorts of other things, cross-generation and whatever. And the attempts at population genetics have failed because they try to... They failed at some levels to model things because there's a whole lot more going on interactively or in these dynamical feedback overlapping cycles than we suspected, right? It wasn't as simple as we thought. So
Sure.
anyway, I'm sort of looking at sort of an overview of, you've got these individuals, they're in a population, they're in an environment. So it's more of a holistic approach to the whole thing, and saying that we need to consider that evolution is happening along both of these axes, even though this one may not end up in the future. It may only affect our lifetimes. I mean,
but as you said, but the germline really doesn't. It's an abstraction, right? As you said, because the arrow is going from the. Yeah. Exactly. So so two things to say about that. One is a lot of interesting work has been done. Actually, I'll mention the guy here by a philosopher I like called Jim Griesemer. He's in California, and he basically has been arguing that we should focus on reproduction, not so much on replication. It's been one of the big problems of late 20th century biology has been to assume that reproduction can be reduced to replication, right? And that speaks directly to this diagram, because what you really have is not replication of DNA that's happening in the ether, right, in the abstract, but rather an entire biological system that is reproducing, right? Right. And so the inheritance is happening. It's, as you say, it's there's no real pink line really. There's the diagonal, and there could be another horizontal line. You could put another horizontal line on top of the pink line to represent everything that is passed on from one individual to the next that is not in the DNA. Everything that is epigenetic. Right. So you've got another line.
There's a lot of that, and one of those things would be culture.
Absolutely. There's this wonderful book by one of my mentors called Evolution in Four Dimensions, where the argument is that you have all these different you've got genetic, epigenetic, behavioral, and symbolic variation in the history of life, and this by Jablonka and Lamb. That's basically their argument, that unless we consider these four dimensions, if we only focus on the first one, on the genetic one, we're going to have a very impoverished picture of evolution. So and there's a lot of interesting stuff to unpack there. But I mean, the fact that we've tended to focus on the pink line just speaks to what I was saying before, that we have abstracted the organism. You don't need to worry about organisms if you're only thinking about genes, right? And if you have that germline, then that's a way of not dealing with the problem, not dealing. The Weissmann's distinction of the germplasm from the soma was an act of simplification. Let's not worry about physiology. Let's not even worry about development. You only worry about inheritance, because that seems to be the only thing we need in evolution. Now, a physiologist, Mike, would never have fallen for that. Because if you ask a physiologist or an embryologist to forget about, you can't ask them to forget about the processes that they're studying. Whereas if you ask about an evolutionary biologist, then, as he did, as he was speaking to at the beginning of the 20th century, then fine, because evolution can be modeled using population genetics, only focusing on genes for the purposes of in this simplified way, then you can afford to forget to eliminate the organism. But if you are a biologist working on the organism, right, working on physiology, working on development, then you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if that. So the reason why I'm pushing back against that is that for me, one of the reasons why we sort of forgot about the organism is that we had this focus on evolution, on this very basic and simplified version of evolution, the population genetics version of the modern synthesis, where you don't deal with organisms really. It's extremely idealized. It's almost like dealing with billiard balls, interacting. It's an extremely simplified model, and let's not forget that life comes in the form of organisms. It doesn't come in the form of genes. The units that are alive in nature are organisms. Okay, so if we want to explain life, we need to reckon with the complexity and the organization that exists in any organism.
Right.
not just focusing on on transfer of information from one germplasm to another that is represented here in the pink line. That's sort of where I was going at.
Yeah, and the thing I was suggesting is that we may have missed something in evolutionary theory because we are
Absolutely.
not, because we're overly
Yeah.
focused on this grander, coarser scheme, and we're not
Yeah.
looking at, in detail at the organism per environment.
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, in fact, many other people are saying that. I mean, people who defend, who are talking about niche construction, the fact that organisms in their activities change the ecological niches, and that then
right.
has an effect on selection, right?
Yep.
That is a consequence of thinking about organisms, right? What
Yeah.
organisms, as you know, about the mushroom, as you put it, thinking about what the mushroom does in the mushroom's lifetime has an influence eventually on selective forces. Right. So yeah, it's even the evolutionists are saying we can no longer abstract away the individual by focusing on populations. We actually have to look at the actions of individuals. But of course, that's, I think, historically it's been difficult to accept because, as I was saying before, evolution happens over long periods of time and it happens in populations. I honestly don't think you can talk about evolution at the individual level unless you're a Lamarckian. I mean, Lamarck's theory would be the sort of theory that would enable you to talk about evolutionary change only focusing on the individual. But Darwin's theory is a theory of populations in some sense, right? And so we have had to deal with this situation over the past 100 years of can we really get everything we want to know about individuals by focusing on populations or not? So that's where I'm coming from. But and of course it's relevant, right? All this stuff is even coming in evolutionary biology. So I'm not saying that, that today, if you're working in evolutionary biology, you're not interested in the individual. I'm actually saying the opposite, that you can't really escape talking about processes that are happening at the individual level today if you want to work in evolutionary theory.
Right. Well, and the other thing, of course, we have viruses and we have horizontal gene transfer and we have all of these other things that have popped up and told us that, well, it ain't that simple. It isn't just gene, or it isn't just germline zipping along, basically unattended. Switching gears a little bit, but maybe not. There's an ongoing battle between me and Danny on Jerry Fodor and natural selection. Are you familiar at all with that battle with Jerry Fodor?
Not in a lot of detail. Maybe you can sort of fill me in a little bit. So what's at stake in this?
Okay, so basically, Jerry Fodor's position seems to be that natural selection is just all wrong, and we should eliminate it, or at least maybe not Jerry's position. Of course, Jerry passed away. Maybe Danny's position. So some current people that are using this are saying that natural selection is wrong because there is no mechanism in natural selection that would tell us whether or not it is the heart pumping blood, so pumping blood, or the thump noise that it makes. There's nothing mechanistic in the theory that tells us which of these two things would be selected for. And that's kind of and when they hit us with it, and we're deep into the biology, we immediately just call them idiots and throw them out. but I'm wondering if there isn't so natural selection as a mechanism, right? And you pointed out in one of your papers or book that natural selection we don't really mean mechanism anymore, right? We're kind of referring to it. We're calling it a mechanism, but that's not really what we mean, because we don't think there's actually some little thing out here that's actually mechanistically or in a law-like manner, creating traits. That isn't what's happening. So I'm just wondering what you think of all that. I think
Elliot Sober, just very quickly, just to say, I mean, I'm not extremely sort of well versed in this literature, but I mean, I am familiar with the distinction between selection of and selection for, right? Which may help explain this, right? So
and coextensive traits,
basically. Exactly, right. So you can talk about the heart pumping the pumping being the feature, that the trait that is being selected for. But what is but what the selection of refers to the actual entity that is and all these coextensive traits that come with the pumping. So I don't know if that, maybe that's too much of a simplification.
Yeah, I don't know. And the criticism is that natural selection should be tossed out because it cannot predict which traits are going to be in the future. And in order to predict that, you've got to add ecology. You got to add a whole bunch of other disciplines to figure that out. And so the criticism is that natural selection does nothing. And that just falls flat on guys like me. I mean, that makes guys like me want to rip our hair out.
I lost the memo. When did we decide that prediction was the basis for explanation?
Exactly. There you go. Thank you. That was my feeling. It's like, wait a minute, we're supposed to predict the future? Is this a seance or is this science?
Maybe for some areas of science, that's what we do. In some areas of physics, right. But I mean, why should we export those epistemic expectations to biology? Maybe biology isn't in the business of predicting the future in the way that you do in Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And the most important thing about natural selection is purifying selection, in that when any of those bricks fail to congeal in that bridge, they will fall down and be discarded and not be part of the bridge, right? So the purifying selection is the very most important thing, and that it cuts out all of that noise, and it finds that pathway that is going to end up being life, going from like one place to another. But yeah, that was my feeling. It's like whoever said that natural selection was supposed to predict whether or not the heart it would be the thump or the heart pumping blood. Of course, we could do predictions and experiments, but natural selection is just basically a filtering function that works, that you can imagine and you can abstract, and it basically operates on populations. And we can look at something that way, but we sure as hell aren't going to even predict probably the simplest Beatles pathway for more than a year, or even a few months, or maybe a few days. So anyway,
I just don't see exactly. I don't see that as necessarily what we're in the business of doing when we're doing evolutionary theory. I mean, that doesn't mean that we can't do retrodiction, where you're essentially looking at the past and trying to work out what happened in the past. I think that is something that evolutionary theory can help us with.
Right.
And then the other thing that it can do is unify. Right. This has this incredible unifying power. I mean, the idea of common descent is so damn successful and powerful in bringing together so many things make sense when you see them through the lens of common descent that didn't make sense before Darwin, right?
Yep.
So there are lots of things that an explanation or a theory can do in science, and I don't see why prediction should have a privileged position in that context.
Right. Yeah, one of the stunning things that I read when I was studying. I've got a book on bones and bone development, and one of the most stunning things I read was that fish have more types of cartilage and bone than mammals do, and somewhere along the line we lost a few of those. But in some modern human diseases, some of those fossilized remains of fish cartilages. And I've got to dig this out again and flesh it out because it was so remarkable. But some of those cartilages from the fish are still hanging around in our genome and causing issues, right?
Interesting.
So that's a way that looking at the evolutionary fossils in the past help us to find something that is currently affecting us, that sort of thing. But
absolutely.
How are you doing for time and energy?
I'm I'm all right. Maybe we can bring things to a close fairly soon. I mean, maybe 10 minutes or something like that. How are you feeling? Are you also? I'm kind of
good.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I burn out fairly fast. Like I started about 4 a.m. and burn out definitely by 11, but 11 or 12. But I'm okay yet. Scott is in the back room, so I'm not sure if Scott wanted to join us or not. But I was just wondering if we didn't go in any of the directions I thought we were going to go. And I'm wondering if you feel the same, and if you have something else, some direction that you would like to take it.
Oh, sure. I mean, I mean, I thought we were going to talk more about. It was great. It was a really good, interesting conversation, and it's always good when you don't know where things are going to go, because it just means we have a lot of things to talk about, and it's always also good when we find points of disagreement. It would be a little bit too boring if we just agreed, right? So it's good
find
to get me thinking. And I have to think more about some of the issues that we talked about. So do you want to talk at all about intelligent design and the sort of case, the machine language and how that's used by creationists? I mean, if you want, we can I figured that might have been one of the things that we would be talking about today. But I mean, whatever you like. As you like.
Yeah, and I think Ben Gold's theory on the talon proteins, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a cell membrane, right? And we have these integrins, that are basically they're actually two proteins. There's an alpha and a beta unit, and then there is a and I'm hoping this will take us where we want to go if you'll just be patient. But there's this this talon protein that basically consists of 13 little units, R0 through 12, I think it is. And these 13 units, and they connect up to this massive actin filaments inside the cell. Well, if you apply pressure on these talon proteins or stretch them, they will either end up, there are a bunch of alpha helices, and they will either unfold and become a one state, or they'll be folded up and they become a zero state. And as a result of that, different other proteins can attach to these things. So what we have is a 13-bit code. And he's calling it a machine code, right? Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with any of this?
No, I'm not.
The protein is talon, and he's done a bunch of remarkable work. And anyway, so he has something called the mesh code theory, and he's talking about, well, for one thing, these talon proteins exist in, I think, virtually every one of your cells, and they are sort of a mechanical sensor, so that if you, like in embryogenesis, if two cells are growing together and they push upon one another, they can change the nature of that code, which will change the nature of the proteins that bind to it, which can become gene regulatory networks of their own and go down and affect DNA, which DNA is transcribed. So this talon code, and that's why I'm very interested in it, because it provides what he found about these talon codes is this is not a very dynamic thing. When you put those things into a certain state, they're very thermodynamically stable, and it can remember that code for a very long time, I think is where they're going at, right? Okay. So what we ended up with is in the mesh code theory, he is suggesting that in the synapse at the end of an axon, oh God, that looks like a dick. I'm sorry. Basically, the synapse, that these talon codes are encoding information inside of that one neuron, right? This is one axon. And, we've got a bouton for a dendrite here. I think, I don't know if I drew this exactly right, but anyway, so that there is information, and there are about 100 of those talon codes. So there's potentially 1,300 bytes of information in every axon, right? And now the intelligent designer that my arch enemy, who I love dearly and hate at the same time, took that to mean that there was, this tremendous amount of information in the brain, in each synapse, right? This is just a synapse. And we've got, trillions of those. And he was taking that to mean that this information could encode a memory of, your mom, that sort of thing. and I pushed back against that sort of thing because it's the wrong grain when you're talking about cognition. And now, of course, I've lost the connection that I was going to make to the whole intelligent design thing. Well, one thing is when you call it a machine code, and that's what they're calling it, the intelligent designers say, aha, we have a program system, right, that was programmed by a designer. So that's part of the problem.
Yeah, maybe we can, maybe we can just take it from there, because that's like the basis, it seems, for wanting to be interested, for the creationists wanting to use this kind of research. So what's going on there at a very basic level, right, is that you have scientists using machine language, and this machine language then obviously includes the notion of design. And so what you have is basically the claim that if biologists are happy to talk about design, then they should be happy to talk about a designer, right?
Yep.
Because you can think of it almost as an analytical, deductive argument that if you have design, you have a designer, almost by definition. And but this, of course, is a debate that goes back for centuries, right? And so you have already Hume noticing in the 18th century that the problem in this argument from design is not in the deductive step of inferring designer from design, but the inductive step of inferring design from sort of organization, from functional complexity. And it was a reasonable thing to infer for a very long time, because we had no explanation for how order emerges in nature. The only explanation we had was what we knew of machines, where the only ordered things that we knew of are machines because we designed them. So the problem is, I think, in contemporary biology, in biologists not being careless with language, and using machine language as a placeholder, as a sort of an umbrella term to cover the whole range of characteristics that suggest that the system is ordered, right? And I think that's where one needs to push back, not in trying to convince people to not talk about a designer if there's design, but in trying to convince people that we shouldn't talk about design at all in biology, because design refers to implies some sort of preconceived plan. It implies intention. And those things are not part of our naturalistic picture. They're not part of how we think about selection. Now, you have had biologists who have decide to bite the bullet and say, well, okay, it's true that fine, I'm going to just accept that there's design and there's a designer, and what I'm going to do is just reconceptualize selection, so that I think of selection as a designer. This was the Dawkins approach when he wrote The Blind Watchmaker. That he chose. It's just completely sort of incredibly ironic and paradoxical that he chose the term watchmaker, of course.
Right.
Yeah, watchmaker, to refer to a process that is antithetical to watchmaking. And Dawkins is just so confused about that, because Darwin was perfectly aware of the watchmaker analogy, because he had read Paley at Cambridge, right?
Paley?
You had to actually read William Paley. Yeah.
Okay.
You actually had to, it was a requirement to enter university in Cambridge at the time to read Paley. Not Natural Theology, but another of his books. So he knew about it, and he knew that was one way in which you could do natural theology. You could use science to provide evidence for a designer, but he deliberately chose. How does the origin begin? It begins with a discussion of bloody pigeons. Why? Because he wants to draw an analogy not with watchmaking, but with breeding. Breeding provides the source of the analogy that's going to give him that concept of natural selection, which is not in itself unproblematic, because selection is also an intentional act. So he also runs into trouble there, and it's maybe also a little bit contradictory to talk about natural selection, given that you are talking about an intentional act in a way that doesn't presuppose any intention. But but at least he had he was smart enough to to, and this is very deliberate, to not want to use that sort of language of design. And so it's very, very, yeah.
I was just saying, it sounds like our language was not ready for evolution, and those principles, and we had to take the words that we had and use those instead, and just sort of imply that well, the meaning has changed. I was looking up design under the Merriam-Webster website, and there's like a for the noun design, like item number 5, it just talks about an underlying scheme that governs functioning, developing, or unfolding. So that still has some of the language of intent, but you see there the attempt to take away the idea of an active creator in there. So I'm thinking our language is still taking a few centuries to catch up to the ideas involved in an unguided process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, but if you just think about how a watchmaker and how a breeder proceeds, what you discover is that they do things in very different ways, right? So, what does a watchmaker do? A watchmaker takes the internal parts of a watch, the gears and the springs and manipulates them to affect the properties of the system as a whole, of the watch, right? If you think of a breeder, what a breeder is doing is manipulating something very different. It's the selective pressure on a population of pigeons, right? You're dealing with entire systems to affect the properties of the parts, of the beaks and the wings and whatever, of the subsequent generations. So you have a very different process of change, and that's why it's breeding and artificial selection that is the source for the idea and the concept of natural selection, and it's not watchmaking. And that's, I think, why Dawkins really doesn't understand evolution, and this really hasn't helped the situation, because it's led so many people to say, well, the evolutionists are the first ones they're perfectly fine using design language and talking about watchmaking. So what's the big deal in suggesting that the designer is an intelligent one rather than selection? And that just shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how selection proceeds. Selection is not an engineering-like process. It's not it doesn't seek optimal strategies it doesn't even try to solve problems. Even the idea of selection as a problem-solving process, where you will have people saying that wings is the solution to the problem of flying, for example, which is completely missing the point and misunderstanding how evolution works. Wings are not a solution to the problem of flying. Wings ended up being co-opted to be used for flying, but they were initially selected for the ability to carry out other functions, right? And this is the problem of retrodiction that we talked about before, right? It's kind of difficult to explain the origin of certain traits, and we should remember that that evolution is not a forward-looking process in the way that design is. There is, because there's no intentionality. So there are a lot of misunderstandings about how evolution actually works that are being exploited by the intelligent design people.
Yeah, and it's often missed that in the breeding example, you start with pigeons. In the watchmaker example, you start with a sheet of metal. There's a big difference. Difference to how you proceed, in designing.
Absolutely, but if you think go on. Can I just say one more thing? I mean, about this. So if I guess you're familiar with the adaptationist debate, right? And the Spandrel's critique of Gould and Lewontin and all that. I mean, a lot of that stuff is also a critique of this machine engineering view of evolution, because what that paper was about was trying to show that we should not atomize the organism into its traits and explain the origins of the traits independently of one another, because organisms are not like that. If you are a watchmaker, mind you, then you can do that. You can basically tell a story about this particular gear and this particular spring, and how you brought them together to create a new watch. But that's not how evolution works. It's not how breeding works.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what we're missing, even in abiogenesis. We're in abiogenesis, they start looking for, how did the L amino acids, the homochirality, the homochiral amino acids, and those nucleic acids, those four, and the ribose, all come together and sort of come out of scratch, right? Where at the time there was a mixture of chirality. There were hundreds of different amino acids. There weren't just the 20 that we're using. There were many, possibly many different nucleic acids. And all of those things are not being researched right now. We're not looking into non-homochiral peptides as a possibility for some of this, some of the early beginnings. Okay, so we're missing those little tiny crazy one-off things in the cracks because we're always looking at this reductive pathway, right back to the from the source to where we are now, saying that what we have now, we have to project backwards and say those are the same chemicals we had in abiogenesis.
Right.
This is not the case, not likely to be the case, and hopefully not the case, because if it had been the case, I don't think life would have happened. If you just had the 20 amino acids, the 4 nucleics, and basically you had just that, it would not have happened. It had to, the pathway depended upon this mess of many, many different compounds in order to find its path. Right.
Right.
And we're missing that, I think, in protein evolution now, that we're looking at, this so-called junk DNA or junkyard or workshop DNA, all of these things that don't do anything. And there are all of these biochemical pathways out there that have not completely connected up in a functional manner, but they're still present in the organism. Sometimes they kill you with cancer. Sometimes they end up in the germline and they end up in the future, causing some new possibility for adaptation, that sort of thing. So,
yeah.
So this whole,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
The whole enterprise of looking non-reductively at life, I think, is the key to truly understanding evolution and abiogenesis, is what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. I agree.
Yeah. This is a something I try to use as kind of an illustration or whatever, but nobody ever appreciates it. So I thought I'd get a picture.
We'll try to like it.
Yeah. If you decide, if we finally achieve some sort of interplanetary travel and we land on a planet and we cross over a hill and look off in the distance and see something like this, the hill with some object over it, what would justify us in saying that this is designed by intelligence and not natural?
Yeah. Well, I think that's how I think that's how the book Natural Theology by William Paley begins, right? He imagines coming across a watch on a heath and wonders where it came from, right? Yeah, exactly. So these are all old arguments for sure.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's just
But in the case of this object, I have no idea how that could have been designed by men or came about naturally.
Right.
I don't have a pathway for either one. Do you? What the hell is it?
Well, the thing that's I forget what they call it, but it's just a mysterious object. This is from the TV series Foundation.
Oh,
they
okay.
Landed on this planet, and this was just there.
Yeah.
Nobody. It has some other properties, but just looking from a distance, just if you're in a totally strange environment with very little precedence, from your experience, what justifies you in saying something is designed versus saying something is natural?
Yeah.
And I like what you were saying about, what we were talking about earlier with the idea of design and complexity in nature. We know of instances where you can have those without there being a design. or an intentional planning, or shall we say? But
yeah,
and that's a good series, by the way. I really enjoy it. I recommend it.
Yeah, I got to catch up on it. It's on Apple TV, right?
Yes,
I think. Anyway, this object is a really good example of we don't know how intelligence would have done it, and we don't know how a natural process would have done it. So we don't know either thing. We don't have the mechanism. Whereas if I find a watch, I know a lot about watchmakers and gear builders and things like that, and watches. So I have all that prerequisite knowledge to determine that it was designed by a watchmaker, right?
I mean, I wonder whether this would be a situation where we come to that distinction I made in our discussion earlier about these two kinds of questions you can ask about what something is like or what it is versus how it came to be the way it is, or whether you can keep it separate or not.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe one way to unblock ourselves from not being able to understand how it came to existence is just to study it, characterize it as without being concerned with that question in the first place, and then maybe that can hold the key to understanding its origin.
Yeah, don't put the cart before the horse.
Yeah, but that kind of leads to the thing that seems most important to us is determining intent, right? We're always trying to find the intent. We're trying to find why is that object hovering above the sky? Well, one physical possibility for that object is on that particular planet, there's a kind of mineral that basically is lighter than air, and it forms crystals, and they float around all over the place, right? So we could discover that, and it's like, oh, so there's a natural solution to how that came to be. And of course, the other one is that there's some weird ass aliens that created it for whatever reason, right? And that would be intent. But you
the notion of intent is.
Go ahead.
Go on.
Oh, you'd kind of want to know which it is, because if there are aliens around that created it, you're going to need to know about those aliens, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a place to bring in, the problem with functional language, right?
There you go.
That, so function is sort of interesting because we don't talk about the function of, of a purely physical process of radiation or of a waterfall or anything like that. But you do talk about functions in biology and in engineering. Right. So that initially, at least, would seem to be a good starting point if you're an intelligent designer, a creationist, to want to focus on that, on the fact that function language seems to be something that we have both in mechanical systems and in biological systems. But I mean, so the difference there is, well, I mean, it's a longer conversation. Maybe we can leave this for another time, because it's a longer conversation we could have about function. Yeah.
Yeah, because that gets to intent. And and basically the reason that we're and we can probably end it with this and just think about this. The reason that we're interested in biological function is that we want things to function so that we may stay alive, right?
Right.
And we are those mushrooms. And once we've reproduced and now we're drawing Social Security, do we really care if we stay? Why do we? But I mean, function in biology is thought to that which keeps us alive, that which keeps the organism alive, keeps it going. But if it's just spinning about like a tornado, running out of steam, why do we care?
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, in the debate, of course we do. Yeah, I mean, the debate in the philosophy of biology has been really between two kinds. I mean, this is just we can talk about this in more detail next time. But two kinds of understandings of function. One which focuses, as you say, on what the system needs to stay alive, right? So the function of the parts is determined on the basis of the contribution that the parts are making to the system, right? Versus a view of function which is evolutionary, which is about what was selected for. That the function of something has to do with selection. And, there's a very long debate that's been going on for about 40 years in the literature and philosophy of biology about how to reconcile these two understandings of function. But it really depends on the area of biology or your kinds of questions that you're asking, right? So this, I think, also relates to this distinction between individual biology versus populational biology. If you tend to be interested in questions about the individual organism, questions physiological, or genetic, biochemical questions, then you're more likely to think about function in the sense of organization, right? In the sense of how a particular part is causally contributing to the maintenance of the system of which it is a part. Whereas if you are working in evolutionary biology, you have evolutionary questions that you want to answer, then you're more likely to use function in that context of, what was selected for the function of the heart. The function of the heart can be understood in these two ways, right? Physiologically, the pumping of the blood is important because the pumping of the blood enables the system to stay alive, because it enables the oxygen to be carried to all the tissues in the system. Whereas from an evolutionary perspective, you can say, well, the heart is there because it was selected for its function being pumping. And then an additional question comes up, which is kind of interesting, is how this relates to the use of function language in machines, right? Because you do talk about the function of, you would do it all the time, the function of a part in the machine. And so there are people who think that function language is of the same kind in machines and in organisms, and there are those who think that it's of a different kind. I think they're of a different kind. Basically, the reason is that a machine has, you can describe the functions of its parts, but you can also talk about the functions of the machine as a whole. The machine as a whole also has a function. The function of your toaster is to heat your bread. But you don't usually talk about functions of whole organisms. An elephant really doesn't have a function. It's about the heart of the elephant that has a function of pumping blood, because that helps the elephant stay alive. But it doesn't really make sense to talk about the functions of entire organisms unless you have some exceptions, of course, with social, superorganisms, beehives and things like that, where you may want to talk about the function of the worker or whatever. But for the most part, there is that distinction. And in a paper I wrote, I tried to connect the distinction with how we think about the distinction between organisms and machines, and talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic forms of purposiveness as being the foundation for why we talk about functions of wholes versus functions of wholes and parts in the case of machines. But that's a little bit compressed. Maybe we can talk about that in a little more detail next time.
Which paper was that? Which paper?
That's my Organisms Are Not Machines paper from 2013.
Okay.
Yeah,
but the thing about the whole machine having a function, that kind of goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, that we consider ourselves being alive and staying alive as being the ultimate function of the machine, right? That's what I want of my body, is to keep me brain alive, right? To keep me going.
Or the ultimate function of us, of a biological system, not of a machine, because machines are not alive, right? We don't really care.
Yeah, well,
but machines are instruments. We use them for our own functions. It's a bit of a different.
Yeah, but I'm drawing a parallel to the function of my whole organism and the function of a whole machine, and that's why we would look down into the different pieces of me or the machine and say, this part is functional to achieve this whole. And the whole for us is to stay alive, because we are selfish little devils, and that's what we want to do, is stay alive. So it's goodbye, cruel world.